So the final type of loop that I'll discuss is a for loop. And a for loop is very useful for instances where we know what we want to iterate before we start iterating. So when we used while loops, we would be looping based on a specific condition, like while something is true, while something is not true, something like that, right? With a for loop, we're going to loop for a specific number of values, and that number of values is going to be something static. So we're going to loop for 5 iterations, or for instance, we're going to loop for everything inside of a list. That's the general idea of what we'd be using for loops for. So we'll take a look at a few different examples of that here. The first one that I'm going to show is how this can be used with lists, because that's one of the main ways that it's used. And it's using what's specifically called a for each loop. So we'll loop for each element inside of a list. So to start off, I'm going to create a list, and I'll call it profits as well. And I'm going to give it some values here. So this is one way that we can define a list, is we can just like type in the values and make it like a constant list like this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for each, we'll say value in profits, or I don't have to have the each there. It's just for value in profits. And I'm going to print value. And I'll explain all of this to you here. What we're saying here is we're saying for each of the values that exist inside of profits. So value is not like a special keyword. I could have used like X here or something else entirely. What it does is it defines a new variable, and it sets that variable equal to each of the things that are inside of that profits list. So what will happen is when we start here, it will take a look at the profits list and it will say, what is the first thing in there? Which would be 100. So it will say X equals 100, print 100. Then it comes back up here and it says, okay, go to the next value, which is 200. So then X equals 200, and it will print that out, and it will continue on and on until we've exhausted the whole list. That's the idea of what this for loop will do. And like I said before, this is referred to as a for each loop. It will loop through all of the things that are inside of a list. So if I go ahead and run this here, you'll see it just prints out all the values that are inside of the list. So this is a very useful loop because it's a very convenient way to iterate through all of the things inside of a list. It's a lot less cumbersome to write compared to like the for while I is less than length of profits. And you don't have to remember to like increment I each time. It automatically increments at the end of the loop. It's just a lot more convenient to work with, and works really well when you don't have a condition that you want to satisfy to end the loop. If we just want to loop a specific number of times, this is a perfect way to do that for our application. So this is one way that we can use for loops. And just to demonstrate maybe another example of this, we can define like variables like test equals hello. Like I mentioned before, strings are able to be treated like lists. So if we do like for C in test and print C, you'll see what will happen is it prints out all the numbers as before, but it prints out all of the characters inside of that string too. So you can see that this would be a way to be able to iterate through a string as well, because a string is treated as a list. So this is the idea of these for each loops. The one other type of for loop that's relatively useful is a for in range loop. What this does is it allows you to specify a range of values that you want to iterate through. So suppose I wanted to do that similar like counting numbers from 1 to 10 example, right? What we could do is we could say for X in range 1, 10. So we specify a starting point and an ending point. And then what we could do is we can just simply print out X. Then when we run this, you'll see that we get all of the values from 1 to 9. Again, we stop right before the endpoint here. So if we want to do 1 to 10, we should say 1 to 11 actually. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that we stop one before the endpoint, right? So this would be another type of for loop that we would be able to use. So these are the main two types of for loops. So like with while loops, you're able to iterate based on a condition being true. So we continue until some condition is no longer true. For the for loops, we iterate for a static amount of time. So either we iterate for everything that exists inside of a list, or we iterate for things that are within a range of values. Those are essentially the two different situations where we're going to use for loops. Now, you can use while loops for essentially every single application. The main benefit of for loops is that they're more concise to write. So if we know how long we want to iterate for, it's a lot easier to write like something for like for x in profits rather than having to define a variable and then do like, while the variable is meeting this condition, that's the length of the list, and then print out the value at I. It's a lot more to write out compared to the for loops. So that's the general advantage of for loops compared to while loops, is that you can iterate static sets of data like lists or ranges without having to do like the whole setup and iteration that the while loop requires.